Good morning. Welcome to CSIS. I'm Olga Oliker. I direct the Russia and Eurasia program here. And before we get started, I'll make the standard announcement that in case of emergency, listen to me. So I am very pleased to welcome Igor Zevelev back to CSIS. Igor is now at the Woodrow Wilson Center. This beautiful report that just came out. If you don't have a copy, get one. Get two. I think they're suitable for giving as gifts. I actually think they make an excellent subversive gift because somebody will say, oh, it's a New Year's card, and it's a statement about the future friendship, which and he's done really a fantastic job. If you haven't already read this, it's a clear, concise outline of both the history of this project and its implications. And I don't know that it's nutshelled quite as well anywhere else. So I'm going to stop talking and let Igor speak for a little bit about his findings here, in this report, and then we can open it up for discussion.
Okay, thank you, Ola. I will probably stand up. First of all, I would like to thank CSIS for giving me a fantastic opportunity to work on my project. I'd like to thank Heather Conley. Thank you, Ola. Thank you, Jeff. And thank you, Oliver, for your support. I just got my copy of the report, and indeed it looks like a Christmas card, and you can use it as a Christmas card. It would be a great Christmas card because it's not an email. So. And it cannot be hacked. And as you know, there are two kinds of people in this city, and those whose emails have been hacked, and those who do not know that their emails have been hacked, by Russians, of course. So, Christmas. But the topic of my report, as you all suggested, is not very merry. So when Russia dispatched its armed forces on the Crimean Peninsula in late February 2014, Peter Baker reported at the New York Times that, quote, Chancellor Angela Merkel told President Obama by telephone that after speaking with Mr. Putin, she was not sure he was in touch with reality in another world, unquote, she said. I would say that Mr. Putin may look like he is in another world to Angela Merkel, but it is important to understand what exactly this world is built on and why so many Russians share Putin's outlook. So today I will talk about Russian national identity and foreign policy, and first I will try to identify the historic intellectual roots and key myths and narratives that inform the present-day Russian worldview and the foundations of foreign policy. And second, I'll talk about national identity in Russia's global strategy today. The recent changes in Russian national behavior surprised both policymakers and academics around the world, and a growing body of literature addresses the question, who is Mr. Putin really, and what is his endgame? And the dramatic shift in Russian policies have been often interpreted as part of Putin's strategy to preserve and strengthen his regime domestically. From my perspective, understanding Vladimir Putin's personality and his domestic political goals is necessary, but absolutely not sufficient to understand the drivers of Russian behavior on the international arena. It is essential to look at broader underlying trends. And President Putin's ability to drive Russia's social and political changes is beyond any doubt. But the question is how he does this and why the radical changes in his foreign policy became possible. I try to look for answers in Russian national identity discourses. And I will highlight those core elements of these discourses that shapes the parameters of the debates. And contrary to widespread belief, I argue that Putin does not shape national discourses, but national discourses shape Vladimir Putin. Putin's goal on the world arena today is reasserting Russia as a great power with a global reach. This means to push back against the United States. Second, stopping what Putin sees as the American crusade to do regime changes around the world. And the revolution in Ukraine was perceived in Russia as a CIA-organized coup on the Russian walled territory, and Russia pushed back. The war in Syria is seen in Moscow in a similar way. The West wants the regime change in Damascus, first of all. And the Kremlin believes that the regime change in Moscow has been the Obama's administration's ultimate goal. Third, breaking the US monopoly of usage of its military power to achieve foreign policy goals, and demonstrating Russia's ability to project its military power well beyond its borders. This is my reading of the Kremlin's objectives. However, there is a larger and even more important point here. This drastic transformation of Russia's foreign policy in recent years was driven by a specific worldview that is broader than concrete objectives, even those broad objectives I tried to outline a moment ago. So I will talk about the historic national identity discourses first and national identity in Russia global strategy today second. James Billington once noted that no nation ever poured more intellectual energy into answering the question of national identity than Russia, unquote. And this observation remains true today. For a century and a half, the debate over the Russian identity, nation formation, and Russia's future was focused primarily on Russia's relation to and interaction with the West. Big ideas in Russian intellectual history that have been adopted by the Kremlin as the foundations of its worldview. First, for at least 200 years, self-styled exceptionalism with some messianic elements has become an essential part of Russian national identity that may be explicit or subdued depending on circumstances. Many Russians feel that they belong to an entity which is bigger and more important than just an ethnic group or nation. Russian intellectuals tended to define their distinctiveness not in terms of an ethnic group that believes in the myths of common ancestry and culture with its peculiar songs, dances, food, and so on. Not in terms of a nation with its sovereign political institutions, but in terms of a civilization with a special set of values and attitudes, distinct spirituality, and universalism. A few words about universalism, or in Russian, Fyodor Dostoevsky used the word «вселенскость». One of the most significant intellectual developments in the 19th century that left an important imprint on later discussions was the idea of the universal character of Russian identity. Started with Slavophiles, this idea was developed, as I said, by Fyodor Dostoevsky, who wrote, quote, "To become a genuine and all-around Russian means, perhaps, and this you should remember, to become brother of all men, a universal man, if you please," unquote. It could be argued that Dostoevsky expressed with remarkable passion some very important features of Russian national consciousness. Its openness remaining practically the same in essence, diluting their ethnic and national identity in broader humanitarian and social missions. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union, this set of ideas took the form of the concept of the Russian civilization, which is different from the Western civilization according to the modern interpretation. So this the first element, exceptionalism. Second, Russia's interaction with Europe and later with the West as a whole have been absolutely central for national identity construction. For a century and a half, the elite tended to define Russia in opposition to Europe as a whole, not to particular European peoples like other European peoples do. For example, Germans or French. So it's not Russia and Germany, Russia or France. The title of Nikolai Danilevsky's book, published in 1869, was telling Russia and Europe. And that set the whole tradition in Russian intellectual history. Russia as opposition to the whole of Europe. The ideas I'm talking about right now have deep roots in the centuries-old debate over Russian identity, and they were developed mostly by the most conservative nationalist thinkers of the 19th, 20th centuries, including Konstantin Leontiev, Nikolai Danilevsky, later on by Ivan Ilyin, and others. And the Kremlin's ideologues today do not turn to the rich intellectual legacy of Russian liberals. The ideas developed by Pavel Milyukov in the early 20th century or Dmitry Likhachev in the second half of the 20th century are not popular today. So Russia and the West, this is the second important component of Russian intellectual legacy in the field of national identity construction. So the vision of the West has been historically very different from Russia's understandings of other regions of the world. Moscow today views Asian countries or China, well, as something just other states, other countries on the map. They are far more removed from Russia's perceptions of self. So interactions are based on foreign policy and economic calculations towards Asia and China, while the attitude towards the West is colored by this search for identity. This is very important. There is a clear asymmetry in Russian foreign policy making when we talk about different regions. Third, perception of the neighboring peoples, territories, and states that have ever been a part of the Russian Empire has been essentially inconsistent and ambiguous. And the Russian intellectual elite of the 19th century and early 20th century mostly, from my perspective, failed to properly address the problem of multi-ethnicity in the Russian imperial nation and the place of ethnic Russians in the state. And the same is true of the Soviet period. As a result, after the Soviet collapse, Russians had a hard time to recognize the neighboring newly independent states, Ukraine and Belarus, first of all, as separate nations. So Russian intellectual history has surprisingly strong impact on the present-day foreign policy. It's not just the field historians should look at. It has shaped continued preoccupation with the West as the other, who is dissimilar and opposite of the self. And the post-Soviet space is seen primarily as a battleground for power and influence between Russia on the one hand and the United States, NATO, the European Union on the other hand. And Western policies towards Eurasia since the collapse of the Soviet Union have only strengthened Russian anxieties. And Moscow is confident that the main goal of the United States and Europe and Eurasia is blocking any Russian attempt to develop as regional hegemonic power. But this is not about geopolitics only. The Western policies are seen in Russia as an attempt to deny Russia its distinct identity and historic mission in the region. So what about national identity construction in Russia today? For almost 20 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the issues of national identity were perceived as intellectually and politically important primarily by Russian nationalists. Post-Soviet liberals, communists, and centrists, whatever it means, largely ignored these issues. And discussions about the new Russian national identity did not have much to do with Russia's foreign policy or national security agenda until approximately 2012, 2014. Only after returning to the Kremlin to start his third term in 2012, Vladimir Putin addressed these questions in earnest. He did it in the context of the effort to restore Russian power on the global arena. The mass protests in Russia in late 2011 and first half of 2012, and the revolution in Ukraine in late 2013, early 2014, allowed, and from the Kremlin's perspectives, forced Russia to securitize the question of identity. That is to make it one of the issues critical for the survival of the Russian nation, statehood, and civilization. And the main feature of Russia's new foreign policy thinking today is the securitization of identity. Characteristically, in his important speech at the meeting of the Valdai International Discussion Club in 2013, half a year before the annexation of Crimea, the president was talking about finding national identity of the country he was already a third-term president of. And that speech opened a series of public statements and speeches, as well as off-the-record conversations devoted to the issue of preserving Russian national identity in a rapidly changing world. And throughout 2013-2016, they have revealed a high level of Kremlin's anxiety about cohesion of the Russian nation and about grave threats it faces on the global arena. And these speeches and conversations and statements also have demonstrated that Russian national identity is no longer an abstract academic subject, but a security and foreign policy concern. President Putin, as well as Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, who joined the official narrative-producing effort, have developed an official discourse that surely reflects the formation of a specific worldview that is based on the Kremlin's interpretation of Russia's history and national identity. And this worldview has deep roots in Russian intellectual history. And this is what this Christmas card-like report talks about. Earlier this year, Minister Lavrov put his signature under the most unusual article ever attributed to a Russian foreign minister, titled Russia's Foreign Policy, Historical Background. It provides an excellent glimpse into the framework of current foreign policy, its philosophical foundations, and general worldview of the Russian elite. And by the way, it doesn't matter if individual members of the Russian officialdom sincerely believe in concrete postulates, concrete dogmas of this philosophy. What matters is that they feel obliged to develop and implement policies in a way that would not contradict the main narrative. And the narrative sets the parameters for policies. Relying on intellectual legacy of the most conservative Russian thinkers of the 19th century, including the Slavophiles, Konstantin Leontiev, Nikolai Danilevsky, and adding some unusual terminology, Lavrov argues that Russia is fundamentally different from the West. According to Lavrov, quote, Russian people possessed a cultural matrix of their own and an original type of spirituality and never merged with the West, unquote. And developing Putin's argument about an existential threat of losing Russian national identity, Lavrov points to the source of this threat, the West, that has attempted, quote, to put Russian lands under full control and to deprive Russians of their identity, unquote. The set of ideas about Russian national identity were further developed by President Putin at his meetings with the National Historical Assembly and Russian Literature and Language Society earlier this year. And the official national identity discourse today may be summarized as follows. First, the Kremlin sees modern Russia as a unique, great power with a mission. From this perspective, the country's international status and prestige may be achieved not only through military might, political influence, and a traditional balance of power strategy. Russia's global role in the 21st century is seen as an entitlement predetermined by its intangible spiritual and cultural status. And in fact, Putin has revived a tradition of self-styled Russian exceptionalism that developed in the 19th century by as I said, the most conservative Russian intellectuals. Second, the overarching imaginary West began to be perceived in Russia as a power which tries to change Russia's unique and increasingly conservative national identity. The West challenges Russian traditional gender roles, Orthodox Christianity, and the role of the leader. Third, Russia's relations with other post-Soviet states are increasingly influenced by the Kremlin's interpretation of history, not by factors that are more usual for maintaining international relations, such as economic interests and traditional security considerations. And three concepts, namely the concept of compatriots abroad, the Russian world, and greater Russian civilization, started playing a bigger role in Moscow's policies towards neighboring countries in 2014-2016. And the Western policies of engagement with the Eurasian countries and attempts to expand NATO and the European Union have been seen in Moscow as meddling on the territory of the Russian world. And my commentary on this topic is available on the CSIS website. It was published in August. To conclude, after the end of the Cold War, Russia failed to get included into European and transatlantic security architecture, and blame not on Russia only, from my perspective. The West did not embrace a new Russia wholeheartedly. And the Kremlin began to look for a place in the international system by relying on domestic discourses and big ideas emanating from within the country. And Russian foreign policy doctrine today stems more from domestic ideas about Russian identity than from existing concepts of the world order, which have developed in the theory and practice of international relations. Collective national identities do change over time. However, in spite of the tectonic domestic and geopolitical shifts that took place when the Russian Empire and then the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia's Russia's identity's transformation has been surprisingly slow. The density of international interactions between Russia and the West remained thin, and institutionalization of this context were embryonic throughout 100 years, starting in 1917. And this makes national collective identity particularly rigid. And today, the Russian ideological discourse has narrowed and moved towards self-styled conservatism. So President Vladimir Putin's policies are deeply rooted in history and tradition. He operates in a specific intellectual and political context and often gives voice to the elite consensus on Russia's role in the world. And this consensus within the Russian elite holds that the special place of Russia on the global stage is predetermined by unique Russian identity based on its history, size, nuclear weapons, necessity to protect long borders, and the sense of being a great power and the center of a distinct civilization. And this identity manifests itself in specific interests and the attribution of particular value to independence and sovereignty. And this may be only natural for a country with a longer than 1,000-year history as a political entity. All this would make the attempts to redefine Russian national identity extremely difficult for any Russian leader in the foreseeable future. And I will stop here, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I thought that was great, and I'm hoping that is going to convince all of you to read the report. I'm going to kick this off with two questions. One is a bit of a challenge. I mean, you say that this is going to be very difficult to redefine. But one question that I kept thinking about as you spoke was, how do you integrate into this narrative nostalgia for the Soviet Union? Because when I think about, you spoke about the Western challenge to Russian traditional gender roles, Orthodox Christianity, and the role of the leader, I think about the last time there was a very successful challenge to all three of those, and that led to 70 years of Soviet rule, which, is comparatively effective. So why do you think this is so set in stone now, and how do you think you can reconcile the nostalgia that remains for the USSR and that experience with this turn to a traditionalism that precedes it? My other question is far more pragmatic. If you're right, and this is going to be a driving force in Russian policy, at least for a while, what is, how should this affect Western policy? How should the US, how should Europe, collectively or individually, be responding to this sort of Russia?
Okay, thank you, Oля. Nostalgia of the Soviet Union, it's a very important topic, and it has very many dimensions: social, psychological, geopolitical, and others. Many opinion polls indicate that people in modern Russia miss primarily two things about the Soviet Union. And these are, first, social safety nets, free education, free medical care, and so on. And second, the great power status. And I disagree with attempts to analyze the Soviet Union as something like it was created soon after the Bolshevik Revolution and collapsed in 1991. There were different periods in the Soviet history. And in today's reinterpretation of the Soviet history, emphasis is put on the periods of Soviet history which are more, so to say, traditional. It's not the 20s with all this revolutionary fever And indeed, it was not a traditional society. If you look at gender roles, the role of the religion, and so on. And then it started to change under Stalin. And we know all those symbolic changes during World War II and the somewhat changed attitude towards the Orthodox Church in the Soviet Union. And so this period as a conservative Soviet Union is particularly important for the modern discourses. And it is primarily propagated, by the way, not so much by the Kremlin, by the Communist Party of the Russian Federation that tries to blend the Soviet experience with some values allegedly developed within the Orthodox Christianity. So this interpretation of the Soviet Union very well fits my narrative about the role of intellectual discourses, the role of history in today's Russian national identity construction. The second question, how should the West react? What should the West do? You want me in 2 minutes outline
quickly.
Western policies towards Russia. From the perspective of this report and from my research perspective, it's very important to recognize that Putin's policies are deeply rooted in Russian history and tradition. And of course, Russian history and traditions have many different things. But we cannot imagine that, well, a new president came in 2000 and changed everything as he wished. Not at all. And the president's popularity cannot be explained by full control over media only. There are many other reasons for the popularity of the president, and it would be helpful just simply to recognize that. And just to take it as a given. For a while, everything changes. It's not forever. But ignoring this, I would say, consensus of the elite about the role of the appropriate role of Russia on the international arena, etc. Well, it would be counterproductive to ignore that, even if Western policy makers do not like it.
All right, let's open this up. I've got a question right here. There's going to be a microphone. Please introduce yourself, state your affiliation and your name, and please do make it a question.
Alexei Savchenko, no affiliation, private citizen. The question is very simple. How, in the view of what you just said, Kremlin is going to celebrate 7th of November 2017? Thank you.
Wow. It's a great challenge. It's a great challenge. And the contradiction is between the Kremlin's attempt to interpret Russian history as a continuous flow from the ancient truths of the 9th century up to today. And everything in our history is valued, is cherished, must be celebrated. We do not reject any period, even the terrible period of Russian history. So we will embrace everything. This is one narrative. And another narrative is conservative, anti-revolutionary narratives about all revolutions are bad. So only the evolution, natural evolution in Russia would be welcome. And this is a real contradiction, and we will see. I think that 100-year anniversary of the revolution will be downplayed a little bit. It will not be a too big thing. Of course, the intellectuals will discuss the anniversary. Of course, there will be some films, movies, and so on. But I suspect the Kremlin would not try to make a big thing out of it because of this contradiction.
Okay, up here.
Good morning. Maxim Kravchuk, Embassy of Ukraine. I have a question to you, maybe very simple or very complicated. What is the place of Ukraine on the political map of the world? In Europe or in Eurasia? Thank you.
Of course, you must map Ukraine, not me, and the Ukrainian people, and it's up to them to construct, up to you to construct your national identity. But I would suggest some thoughts about how Russia views that. Of course, there are different perspectives in Russia, but I'm talking primarily about the official mainstream perspective. This is what I'm trying to analyze. And of course, there is a very strong pro-Western liberal tradition in Russia, even today. So there is a nationalist narrative, but I'm trying to concentrate on more or less centrist official perspective. First of all, Russia, most Russians have very difficult time in recognizing Ukraine as a separate independent nation. Of course, officially it is recognized that Ukraine is a sovereign country, there are diplomatic relations, etc., and so on. But deep inside, there is no clear boundary in the mental maps of many Russians between Russia and Ukraine. And it's not, from my personal perspective, and you may disagree with me, it's not totally groundless because linguistic, ethnic maps are blurred. And political boundaries do not totally correspond to mental maps of many Russians. And so there is an inherent tension between the existence of political boundaries and the realities of today's system of international relations, and these perceptions, which are deeply rooted in history. Of course, it doesn't mean that political choices made by the elite are not important. They're very important. So the choices, well, have been made in 2014 and later on. So about Ukraine in Eurasia or Europe, once again, it's up to you to define.
Okay, all right. In back.
Thank you. Anastasia Popova, Russian political activist, consultant. Would it be fair to say that Vladimir Putin's reflections of Valdai Forum 2013 about Russian identity was actually answered by himself during the 2014 Valdai Forum when he spoke out probably Russian national idea and foreign policy strategy in his very brief and concrete manner when he said that Russian beer is not going to ask anyone's permission for anything. Thank you.
Well, I think that the president's speech at the Valdai Discussion Club in 2013 was really important because it outlined the parameters of the debates that developed later on. Of course, at that moment in September 2013, no one planned those actions that would be taken in 2014. But intellectually, probably the parameters of future debates were set. While in 2014, from my perspective, it was an attempt to explain what have been done, once again, within those parameters.
Jeff?
Thanks, Igor, for a really interesting talk. If I could, I actually have two questions for you. One is about China. You mentioned that Russia's relationship with China, in contrast to its relationship with the West and European countries, is pragmatic, and it's based on traditional foreign policy calculations. And I wanted to push you on that a little bit, because in the last couple of years, the way that we've heard Putin and other Russian leaders talk about China is not just as another country. It's as an alternative civilization, one that has political and maybe other kinds of affinities with Russia itself. It's an alternative pole of identity. If Russia can't turn to the West, then perhaps it's going to turn to the East. So could you talk a little bit more about the role that China plays today in this construction of Russian identity? And then the second question I wanted to ask you has to do with alternatives. Because if you're right, and this particular national identity narrative has achieved a hegemonic position only comparatively recently, then there have been other strands of thinking about what it means to be Russian that played a more prominent political role up to, let's say, 2012 or 2013. What's the status of those alternative identity discourses, and what do you assess the possibility of their returning to play a more prominent role at some point in the not too distant future?
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. China. I said that Russian policies towards China is driven primarily by pragmatic considerations. I would have said towards China per se. And thank you for your question, because if we put Russia's China policy in a broader context, we will see it's not about pragmatism only. It's also about, well, China as an alternative to the world order shaped by the West. And the attitude towards China, on the one hand, is pragmatic, but on the other hand, as soon as it is driven not only by China per se consideration, but also the attempt to show the West that we have geopolitical and civilizational alternatives in the world, it becomes less pragmatic. So, but once again, this less pragmatism is driven by the West, which is present in Russian thinking about China. It's not about China per se. About China per se, it's all pragmatism. The second question about the alternative. Of course there are the alternatives. Very simplistically, we may identify at least three schools of foreign policy thought in Russia. And they are, first, these great power realists, centrists, statists, whatever you call them, государственники in Russian. The second is pro-Western liberals, and the third one is nationalists. And there are all different kinds of nationalists in Russia. There are ethnic nationalists, there are imperialists, and so on. And there are lively debates, though these debates have become less lively, I would admit, recently. And this great powerism, this state nationalism have become the mainstream. What happened in 2012, 2013, my understanding that those statists borrowed some ideas developed by nationalists before and blended them into the mainstream centrist, by Russian standards, centrist discourse. and pro-Western liberals have been marginalized, but they remain strong intellectually. And this group of foreign policy thinkers include not only Russians in Russia, but, well, a new Russian diaspora, too. So, well, the outcome is unknown, but the influence of the ideas I try to describe in my remarks and in the report will remain strong anyway.
Great. Andrei?
Sorry. Okay. Andrei Larion, Kennan Institute. Igor, good morning. Thank you very much for taking such an interesting and stimulating topic. But it's rather risky, as we all know, to talk about identity. And that is why I'd like to ask you two questions. One personal, very personal, sorry about that. And another more general one. Okay, personal, do you consider yourself Russian? If
Yes,
you can,
yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Go ahead to the second
If you
question.
consider you Russian, do you share this Russian identity that you have described in your presentation, in your report? Do you consider these identities that you described as your own, or your personal identity is different from what you have described? The personal question. And the general, I have a feeling that what you have described does not have the kind of universal approach to the all Russian people, because it's only some part of the Russian people, and looks to me rather narrow one, a rather small one. It's not even a majority. And it's mostly maybe the so-called political elite that is trying to produce its own, not a real identity, but their project, official project of Russian identity that they would like to impose on the Russian people and some other people. And second, another part, it's also, seems to me, it has not much historic, at least second, reliance on historic roots, on Russian historical roots. And I would just mention several examples that would be demonstrating that Mr. Putin is not a traditionalist, but a revisionist of Russian history. Where you've seen in the Russian history war with Ukraine? Never, until Mr. Putin arrives. Where you've seen in the Russian history consideration of Crimea as the cradle of the Russian Orthodox Christianity? Never, until Mr. Putin started to talk about this. Where you have seen in the Russian history erection of monument to Ivan the Terrible? Never. In the Russian Empire, that was considered possible to erect such a monument. So I can continue, and we can just. There are many others. So it seems to me, I'm just coming back, seems to me what you have tried to describe, it's very important, interesting. This is not a real Russian identity, but the project that actually Mr. Putin himself, in the early years of his presidency, was considering himself as a part of the West when he was talking about the joining NATO. Russia is joining NATO as a full-fledged member. It's not antagonist of the West, it's a part of the West. So that is why even in the history of one particular person, biography of one person, we can see very substantial differences at early stage and later. So that is why, what do you think that what you have described is a project, artificial project, very recent one, very important for understanding the current policy and current type of thinking and attitude of the current West towards this current Russian regime, but it is not real Russian identity.
Okay.
Thank you. First of all, I do not believe that national identity is somewhere out there and we should simply discover it. And it exists somewhere outside our minds. I believe in discursive nature of any national identity. People debate and negotiate the parameters of their national identity in any country. Second, any national identity is dynamic. It changes over time. So I pointed out that Russian national identity, or a certain interpretation of it, is rather rigid because of the Soviet and then Russia isolation from the rest of the world during 100 years for most part of the 20th century. But this is unusual. This is unusual because identities do change. I strongly believe that the modern American national identity is very different from what it used to be 100 years ago. And the same thing can be said of any nation. Second, I do believe that collective national identities and individual identities, these are different things. And collective national identities is not a simple sum of individual national identities, though some American political scientists and theorists would challenge this assumption. So I believe that national identities are constructed by the elite, by politicians, by intellectuals, by educators. The way they present history to the people, people internalize this and produce their own attitudes already on individual level. It's a very complex process. So there is no point it's not helpful from my perspective to debate what is Russian national identity. What is helpful is to analyze the debates about Russian national identity and see, well, the vector. So where does it develop? And popular attitudes do change in Russia today as we speak. The most recent Levada Center opinion poll results were published earlier today, this morning. And they indicate some changes in Russian attitudes. For example, one of the questions was, do you believe that Russia, and there are several options people chose from, has a unique path of development. The second option, it should develop well within a general democratic market economy model developed in the West with some Russian peculiarities. And the percentage of people who chose the second option, thus putting Russia into a broader context of Western development, has increased in a year by 7 or 8 percentage points, if I'm not mistaken. You and I can check the results. So there are certain parameters. You cannot persuade Russians that their country is a small Southern American country. Of course, there are certain parameters, objective parameters, but you can change by policies, by rhetoric, by the efforts of intellectuals and educators, the way people think about their identity over time. So it's not helpful from my perspective to talk about what is real national identity and what is a project. Debates. It's a discursive nature of national identity. That's what I would insist on. This is, as Renan said about a nation, it's an everyday referendum to be a nation. So in a similar way, we are not born with certain identities. These identities we acquire through family conversations, through education, through reading, through our own thinking, and it may change, but not very quickly.
Okay, great. Up here.
Yes, Mike Bossart from Department of State, recently retired. A question about how the concept of silenskost in this conservative Russian intellectual development developed. What were its main underlying components? Was it primarily the idea of Russian as the center of and keeper of Orthodox Christianity for the whole world? Was it the idea of Russia as protector of primarily Slavic peoples? Was it another idea? Was it the idea of Russia as a natural hegemon in a loosely defined geopolitical territorial space? Or was it a mixture of all three, or were there other components as this developed in the 19th and 20th century?
Mm-hmm. This idea of Zelenskost, as I said, was present in the writings of the Slavophiles and later on developed by Fyodor Dostoevsky and Vladimir Sergeyevich Solovyov. So the idea of Zelenskost is much broader than the Orthodox Christianity and broader than belonging to the Slavs. It's broader than all that. Zelenskost, according to Dostoevsky, is the ability of the Russian people to absorb everything, to feel everything existing in the world, to feel the pain of all Europeans. In the 19th century, they thought primarily about Europe when they talk about Vселенная or universe. Well, Asia was basically a non-existent entity in the discourse. So when you absorb all the achievements, pains, and contradiction into yourself, you become a true Russian. It's difficult to comprehend. It's very difficult in a minute to describe this very broad philosophical concept. But let me make a very rough parallel with American exceptionalism, with strong belief of Americans that their values and institutions are broader than just the United States as we see it on the map. It may change, by the way. The same is with this Russian idea, which less about institutions, but more about spirituality. So we are universal in terms what we think, and those ideas that we developed are applicable to everyone because everyone's ideas and feelings we absorbed into ourselves. So it's broader than the state, it's broader than the Slavic language, it's broader than the Orthodox Christianity, it's universal. I do not know, probably I fail to describe very complex ideas developed by philosophers in few sentences. I invite you to join me in reading дневник писателя Dostoevsky and so on.
Thank you very much, Massimo Calabresi from Time Magazine. And thank you for the broad historic scope of your comments. I hope you'll indulge a journalist's rather more short-term interests. Where does the expanded use of influence operations and active measures to undermine democratic elections, both in the near abroad and now obviously further afield, fit with this national identity-based foreign policy? Is it a warning? Is it a retaliation for what is perceived as CIA influence operations, both resulting in the outcome of the Cold War and in the expansion of NATO? Or is it advancing specific goals of this foreign policy agenda? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Frankly, I do not see the direct linkage between national identity debates and influence operations and active measures, as you call that. But let me comment nevertheless. First of all, I have not been briefed by the Kremlin lately, so I do not know any other facts that you already know. So my understanding, there are different perceptions of the facts. The president-elect has his own perception, as you know. It's very difficult to discern the motives and the goals if we, for a second, for theoretical purposes, accept that the facts are true and we have conclusive evidence. What are the motives and the goals? To support one candidate over the other? I doubt that this goal was set. It is an unrealistic goal. And to expect Russia to influence the outcome of the elections in the United States with its decentralized system of voting would be a too ambitious goal from my perspective. How could Russia, as one commentator suggested, could influence the voters, could influence Hillary Clinton to ignore Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, yeah. So, but what is interesting about these debates, from my very theoretical perspective, there is very interesting work by a political scientist named Thomas Risse-Kappen. In the 90s, he published several works about transnational coalition of like-minded people. And in his research, he tried to analyze this new thinking developed in the Soviet Union under Gorbachev. And he insisted on the importance of those transnational networks of, I may add my own terminology to his writings, of liberal internationalist thinkers in different countries. What we see now around the world is that complete intellectual dominance of liberal internationalist foreign policy thinking gives way to illiberal nationalist thinking. And we see some affinity of ideas expressed by President Putin and President-elect in this country. Some Russian commentators argued that from Moscow's perspective, Trump sees the world it should be. And so we see some affinity here, and that gives all kinds of conspiracy theories that if there is intellectual affinity, that means there are some active measures and operations. And this is a complete, it's the same thing as the Soviet and then Russia propaganda said each time when they see some activity of pro-Western liberals in Russia that they could not act independently. Of course, they were influenced by influence operations and active measures and so on and so forth. Sometimes it may be true, sometimes it may be not.
I have to say, I also wonder if to some extent part of being a great power, having spent all this time being convinced that the United States does this all over the world, if you can do it, we can do it, right? A certain amount of Russian foreign policy over the last couple of years has been emulation, right? You can invade countries, we can invade countries. You can interfere in elections, we can interfere in elections. Anything you can do, we can do better.
Of course.
I do
Yeah,
think
and we
there's-
can.
Evidently. Okay, let's, right here.
Good morning. I'm very sorry that I was late for the talk.
Please give your name.
But I
and
have a lot of
affiliation.
questions. My name is Alex. I'm a Fulbright scholar from Russia studying public policy here. My question is related to the Slavophile analysis that you did. As you probably know much better than myself, the paragon of statehood for this school of thinking has always been Eastern Roman Empire, and they always measured, intellectual capacity of their interlocutor in the sense, would this person respect and acknowledge that it has been a great power and it has historically been a paragon for Russian leaders to emulate. If we think about the current state Russia currently is in, it's surrounded by many, I would say, not necessarily adversarial, but at least not necessarily openly hostile, but we'd say unfriendly states and unities. It has a very extensive role in the Middle East, and its relationships with the West are tense as well. These are all the same things that, the same features of a millennium of Byzantine Empire as well. My question is, how would you say first, Russian modern identity is different from Eastern Roman, or, as some Western historians call it, Byzantine empire, and where is it the same where we don't see it? Because I see it's very similar in many ways. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. The image of Byzantium, of the Eastern Roman Empire, is sometimes invoked in current national identity debates, but not too often, at least by the official ideologues. When it is invoked, though, it's often about the reasons for its collapse and disappearance of this identity. Where are Byzantium people? Where are they? And that sets alarm bells in the minds of many ideologues that if we do not strengthen our identity, if we do not protect our state, without which our identity cannot exist, unlike among some other peoples, so we will follow the way of Byzantium. Nothing is out there except some, architecture, well, some set of ideas, but there is no people, there is no identity. So it's often evoked in a negative way. We should not follow this path.
Okay. Other questions? Igor, do you have any final thoughts you want to leave this excellent audience with?
Yeah, well, thank you very much. And I invite all of you to join me in reading the great works of Russian intellectuals of the 19th century. And you will be surprised that it will help you to better understand the current policies.
And I'd like to encourage you to read the work of great Russian intellectuals of the 21st century as well. And you can start with Igor's report. So thank you very much for joining us, and thank you for being here.
Thank you.